The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, and our Francophone editor, Geraud Neema in beautiful Mauritius. A good afternoon to you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, we have a lot to talk about this week. Geraud, we're going to focus most of our discussion on your beat in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the first ever visit to China by President Félix Tshiskedi. But first, Cobus, there was a story that broke today by Reuters about a Chinese hacking operation in Kenya. And I think this took a lot of people by surprise. They basically said that the Chinese were hacking documents from both the foreign and the finance ministry. Reuters quoted unnamed sources, Kenyan cybersecurity experts. We don't really know the sources, again, because they all wanted to remain anonymous. That is typical for this type of reporting. But Cobus, what was interesting about this was they weren't spying for geopolitical reasons, apparently. They weren't spying on the Americans. They were spying to make sure they were going to get their money back. Tell us a little bit more about the story.
This is a really interesting story. The Reuters did this investigation of Chinese hacking of 8 ministries and government departments within the Kenyan government, including the Office of the President, over 3 years. So it's a huge operation, and it ran from 2019 to 2022. And they were quoting cyber security experts in Kenya, but then they were also kind of cross-referencing it with very high-level cybersecurity, agencies in the US. So it looked like all of this was to make sure that Kenya would be able to pay its debts to China, which, if true, I think is notable. It's really interesting. And it shows how anxious China is about these things. But then also, it may be, the way that I saw it is like, how opaque are these loan agreements? When even the Chinese don't know exactly what's going on. It's really revealing. I think it's causing a huge scandal in Kenya. So it's going to play internationally, I think.
It's not necessarily that the Chinese don't know what's going on. It's that they want to know what the Kenyans are doing, because I think everybody wants to be repaid. This has been the issue in Zambia as well, where in the debt restructuring talks, the private creditors are afraid that a backdoor deal is going to be made between the government and the Chinese, or the bondholders, or the IMF, and there's a lack of transparency in the process. So I can see where espionage would come in to try and at least get some clarity, so that when you walk into the negotiations, or you're at least sitting on the other side of the table, you have an information advantage over the other side. Let me just give you some of the various denials that have come out across the board. The Chinese embassy in Nairobi called this a false report and called it groundless, far-fetched, and sheer nonsense. Interesting that the presidency in Nairobi said, the allegations of hacking attempts by the Chinese government entities is not unique, adding that the government had been targeted by frequent infiltration attempts, listen to this, guys, from the Chinese, American, and European hackers. And I think this speaks to one of the other issues that we've talked about for years when it comes to these types of hacks, that everybody in the US and Europe will clutch their pearls and say, shock that the Chinese are spying in Africa, when we know from some of the released documents, whether it's the Snowden documents or it's any of the various leaks, that the British, the French, the Americans are all spying in Africa, and Africans are spying on each other as well. So I think in some respects, it's not exceptional. What's exceptional about this, Cobus, as you pointed out, is that the motivation for it. That's, again, what makes this absolutely interesting. One other quick denial that came out of Beijing, that the foreign ministry said they're, quote, not aware. And the embassy in Britain that Reuters contacted called the allegations baseless. Geraud, as somebody who has been following this story for some time, what's your reaction to the story that China was allegedly spying on the Kenyan government?
For me, that story is going to echo to the rumors that most of the time come out when Chinese offers those building to African government, building parliament, building different infrastructure in Africa, those government infrastructure. Most of the time, those quote unquote gifts always come with those rumors that they're spying on the African government. And the story came out because of the story that was told about the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. So when you have those stories about Chinese spying on African government, I think it's going to echo more on those issues about China offering infrastructure building and building those governmental institutions. So on the story itself, it's really quite interesting, as Cobus said, in a way that China really got worried about the fact that we need to know what's really going to happen there. As you mentioned yourself, it's always an advantage to come on the table to know that, you know, your counterpart is really truthful to what he's saying. Does he really have a real issue about paying this debt, or is trying to get a deal behind my back? And China, being China, is trying kind of to have the upper hand and to try to understand what's really happened. And for me, it also speaks about how much China itself is kind of afraid, and it goes against the narrative that China is very in that loan, that debt trap narrative that China is really trying to trap African country. It's expressed the idea that China is kind of nervous itself to know that, you know, I want to make sure that my money is going to be paid back in return. So yeah, it's a very interesting story to follow, and I'm not really surprised by the denial coming from both Kenyan authorities and Chinese authorities. But the one from the Kenyan authorities is really interesting to say, you know, China is not the only one in this situation, so don't come and say China. You are all in that same circumstances here in Kenya.
Yeah, I think that's important. Cobus, it was interesting because, you know, this story broke this morning as I was talking to a scholar in Africa, and right in the middle of the conversation, the alert popped up on my screen, and this scholar was talking to me about how African agency with the Chinese has improved markedly over the years. And I disagreed. We had a spirited discussion, fun discussion, but I disagreed. And just as this came out, I pointed out to the scholar, I said, this speaks to the power asymmetry between the Chinese and their African partners. That is, yes, maybe African agency has improved, but because of the power differential that exists, that one can spy on the other for an information advantage. One has the advantage over wealth. One has the advantage on size. There's so many advantages that China has in its dealings with African countries. And by the way, this is not unique to Africa. This is the same in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, South America, and other countries as well. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this in the context of the asymmetries in power and agency between China and, say, a country like Kenya.
I think this is in a lot of ways is an interesting, it forces one to have a little bit more of a nuanced idea of agency, I think, because on the one hand, I agree with you, these kind of power differentials are huge. And the way that, you know, the China's power to just kind of tap into networks within these other countries and just kind of listen in, you know, is disturbing. At the same time, as Geraud said, like, you know, it really kind of reveals a certain amount of fear within China about these loans. Not only obviously about the economic impact, but also their global political impact. You know, and there's clearly a lot of, you know, some anxiety around wanting to make sure that the loans just kind of get repaid smoothly without, you know, moving into a Zambia-style, you know, kind of debt renegotiation nightmare. So in a way, it shows that even though China has so much more power than Kenya, it's also on the hook to Kenya in notable ways. And I think it's a real kind of like, it's a real kind of counter argument to this kind of debt trap idea, particularly the idea that China is impervious to risk. You know, that China is willing to kind of throw money at these kind of bad deals in order to then gain political leverage. I mean, China has plenty of political leverage in Canada, but they're clearly still very anxious about the actual loan. You know, so in a way, I think, you know, yeah, China does have more power, but like it has power in a way where weaker countries still kind of maintain some kind of leverage over them, particularly as spoilers, essentially, you know, kind of as kind of examples of bad Chinese dealings in the world, you know, kind of, though we know in contemporary geopolitics, those count for a lot. And I think Beijing knows it too.
Interesting also to think about the interagency coordination on the Chinese side in order to do something like this. One of the things that we've heard over and over again from various scholars is that the Ministry of Finance that controls the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank is oftentimes siloed off from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the various other ministries, commerce and whatnot. And so they don't always talk to each other about debt. But I presume that it's the Ministry of State Security, which is the Chinese equivalent of the CIA, that does this type of international espionage. So clearly, there was conversations outside of the Ministry of Finance into MSS or one of the other security agencies in order to pull off an operation like this. Again, it's alleged. The Chinese have denied it. The Kenyans are playing it down. The African reaction in many ways is very similar to what Geraud was saying back in 2018 with the allegations that Huawei and the Chinese were spying on the African Union headquarters. Paul Kagame's famous quote at that time, if you recall, was, if we didn't want to be spied on, we should have built our own damn building. And that's in typical Paul Kagame style. And it was this attitude where I think, again, weaker states kind of accept the fate that they have, that they've been pushed around from the beginning of time by the big, powerful states. So, again, I think there's going to be a lot of shock. What do you think, gentlemen, very quickly before we move on to the DRC? Geraud, I'll talk to you first, and then Cobus, I'd like to get your take on this. How do you think the U.S. and the Europeans are going to make hay of this? Because it's going to come into the conversation and the discourse. So, Geraud, what do you think?
But of course, they're going to use it. They're going to use it as the first element I mentioned before about the Chinese spying, using the building, the infrastructure, the governmental building they do build in Africa. They're using it. They're also going to use it to talk about that Huawei issues. We know that so far Huawei is still welcome in Africa. Huawei is still equipping many infrastructures in Africa, governmental infrastructure, mind you, computers, networking and everything. They're going to surely using and say, they've been able to spy on you because you keep on using Huawei, you keep on using ZTE, and you keep on using other Chinese and technological equipment. So we do think that, you should be careful. So we should expect that the Huawei conversation and the building and the spying, all of that to come handy and to become another point of discussion in the coming days.
And just to be super clear here, and I know this is not what you're saying, but I do want to emphasize this. We don't know if this was connected to Huawei or ZTE. More importantly, they don't need Huawei and ZTE to do this kind of spying. This kind of espionage is done with lots of different technologies. But I see your point. I just didn't want to have anybody necessarily assume that's what you were saying there. Let's go to you, Cobus. Last thoughts. And by the way, programming note, we've actually just conveniently, by happenstance, we've got a Kenyan scholar who specializes in cybersecurity scheduled to come on the show later this month or early next month, I think it is. So we're going to dive a lot deeper into this topic again later, but let's give the last word before we move on to the DRC to you, Cobus.
I think it's this issue of whether it was a Chinese network or not is really crucial, I think. Because as far as I understand, according to the Reuters report, the way that they got access is through what they call spear phishing, which is essentially, kind of is the old way of sending someone an infected attachment, which apparently a Kenyan bureaucrat had downloaded. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it was via built-in kind of access, via Chinese networks. We will have to see. Also, just a little detail that the Chinese linked hacking team, suspected of having done this work, their name is Backdoor Diplomacy, which, yikes.
That sounds like a porn movie. Oh, my God. Jeez, I don't even know where to go with that. Okay, let's leave that. That's very funny. Okay. So on Wednesday night at 10 p.m. at Beijing Capital Airport, a beautiful, beautiful plane landed loaded with 300 ministers and business people and an entourage that would make any Hollywood celebrity just green with envy. Your president, Geraud, arrived, Félix Tshiskedi, in Beijing for his first trip as president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a very important trip. I mean, there is no way to overstate it. In fact, you wrote today that it's probably the most important of his presidency right now. There is a lot going on. We're going to go into all of the different issues, but let's talk about the week that we had, because before the president arrived, some of the top ministers, foreign minister, the mining minister, they were all in town laying the groundwork for this trip. Let's kind of set the scene before we get into what Tshisekedi himself is going to be doing and thinking on this trip. And let's talk about the run up to it. So give us a little bit of the background.
So the background is early this week, we had a huge delegation coming from Kinshasa. We had a lot of ministers, finance ministers, mining ministers, oil and gas. Officials were also on the delegation. They arrived in Beijing. They started different conferences and meetings with different Chinese stakeholders, most of them companies and, some officials to prepare, the arrival of President Tshisekedi. And we also had the Foreign Affairs Minister, Christophe Lutundula, who met his counterpart in where they spoke about the DRC-China relationship, and Mr. Lutundula said it was an opportunity to revitalize new DRC-China relation, as if the two countries had problem before. I was kind of surprised by this comment, but yes, it was a moment for a new relation. When we hear the Congolese government spokesperson, who also mentioned that it's a new era for China and DRC relations, so we feel a lot of optimism behind this trip that President Tshisekedi is making in China. A trip that came for me a bit late, because when you know how much China is important to DRC economy, the first investor in the mining industry, the first trade partners in the country of the DRC, President Tshisekedi is coming to China in a very last year of his first term, in an election moment, so it's very quite strange. And he also coming in a moment where he has a lot of issues, a lot of topic on his agenda regarding to China and DRC relations. So
let me just stop you there very quickly. Everybody's focusing on the mining issue, and we've talked a lot about that, and we're going to get into the details of that. But you and I earlier today, when we were planning out our coverage, we made a long list of other things that Félix Tshiskedi wants to talk about when he's meeting with Xi Jinping and also with his Chinese hosts. Let's go through the politics, the military, the trade, and some of the other issues that they're talking about.
So in the other context that we have to take into account during this trip is to understand what Félix Tshisekedi is going to have in the back of his mind. He's arriving in China in a very, as I said earlier, in a very difficult and complex situation back home. It's election year. He's facing large opposition where you have his former ally Moise Katumbi and also a faithful opponent of him, Martin Fayulu. He's coming in a context where he's under a lot of pressure from the international community, which is kind of worried about how the electoral process is evolving in the DRC. They're kind of anticipating they might have violence and instability in the country. So it's, that's political tension. There's also the security tension in the eastern part of the DRC, where we have the M23 with Rwanda's backing and everything. And Tshisekedi is hoping to get international support from the international community to condemn Rwanda, to put Rwanda under sanctions. So far, nothing has happened yet. So despite how much DRC is close to China, China hasn't really condemned Rwanda at all so far. The only thing that China has done so far is supporting DRC stance when the DRC was calling for lifting the ban on lifting the UN ban, the notification regime that was imposed on the DRC. Because of that, the DRC could not buy a certain type of military equipment. So since that ban was lifted, China was able to sell drones to DRC, and it's in all this context that President Tshisekedi has arrived in Beijing and is going to meet his Chinese counterpart, trying to take into account all the international context, the US-China tension, the DRC has agenda, its own personal and political agenda, and to try to find the way to make China an ally, a kind of friend in the upcoming and difficult situation that's coming ahead in the coming months.
And as we also mentioned, all of this is also happening against the background of a drive by President Tshisekedi to try and renegotiate some of these mining contracts with Chinese mining companies. So there's been leaks this week of apparent plans to try and kind of increase the DRC's share in some of these deals. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what they'd actually like to achieve.
Exactly. So there were some leaks coming from Jeune Afrique and other media where there was a report that was drafted by a special commission that President Tshisekedi has put in place that was supposed to come up with what is to be a strategy and the goals that they want to achieve. So depending on the media, when you read the report, when you read what Jeune Afrique is reporting on the story, the Congolese, they do believe that, they ought to have much more shares into the Sikomin deal, to go from 32% maybe to 70%, because they do believe that they'd bring much more on the table, and Chinese company had made much more revenue since they started that. And the other reports are mentioning that the strategy is not to ask to necessarily have the majority shares in the Secomin joint venture, but to have much more balanced revenue shares and administration to the Secomin, because so far out of the 12 administrators, only 2 are coming from the Secomin side, which means the Congolese side, and the remaining are coming from this China side. So they're asking much more representation from the DRC and to cancel certain economic advantage the Secomin got since the beginning. So it's a wide range of action that they want the deal to take. So in a way, it's going to reflect much more the equilibrium between what the DRC want and what China wants. But the biggest issue so far will be to convince the Chinese companies that the evaluation the DRC has made is valid and they have to agree on that. And this is the very first hurdle.
Let me just stop and pause for a second here, just to provide a little bit of background information. Geraud, stop me anytime that I say something wrong here. So when we're talking about these mining deals, there's really 2 big ones in particular. There are a lot of mining entities from China in the DRC, but there are 2 big ones that you'll hear a lot about. The first one is called Secomin, and that is a consortium that is made up of Gécamines, which is the state-owned mining company in the DRC, and then 2 major Chinese companies with a bunch of smaller ones, but Sinohydro and China Railway, which make up the Chinese consortium. They have a joint venture. The question that Cobus was talking about was the share and the ownership of that joint venture that the Congolese feel is not fair and was negotiated under the predecessor of Tshisekedi, Joseph Kabila, who basically, negotiated, a crap deal, and the Congolese got completely screwed in it. The second mining deal that is also under discussions, and the mining minister met with the CEO, I think Sun Wen is his name.
Sun Wen.
Wen, yes.
Exactly.
And in Beijing this week for the China Mali. I can never say the full name of the company. How do you say it? China Molybdenum?
China Molybdenum.
I can never say it. Anyway, luckily they go by CMOC or China Mali. And they have a controlling share of the Tenke Fungurume mine, which is, I think, the largest copper cobalt mine in the world. It was previously owned by a U.S. company called Freeport-McMoRan. It was sold to CMOC, and now the Chinese have a controlling share. In both of these cases, there is a dispute over the reserves, that is, the known reserves in the mines. The Chinese have allegedly understated that. And by the way, as we heard from the Congolese finance minister, Freeport-McMoRan also did this. So this is not uniquely a Chinese thing. So prior to selling to the Chinese and to CMOC, they too understated the reserves. And so there's been this fight over the past year or two since Tshisekedi came to power to renegotiate these contracts. The TFM deal was cleared in April, I think April 18th or 19th, and they said they reached some resolution. What we are learning now, though, is that the details of a deal between Gécamines and TFM is still not certain. And also what we started to hear is that not only are the Congolese negotiating tough with the Chinese, but within the Congolese side, there's not consensus either. So they're really fighting a 2-front war here, both amongst themselves and with the Chinese to get better deals. Did I miss anything or did I say anything incorrect there, Geraud?
No, you said everything right. Let me make a small correction concerning and taking Fungurume the TFM. It's the largest cobalt mine, not the copper mine. The largest copper mine is in Chile. But yes, in terms of cobalt, Tenke Fungurume mining is believed to produce 15% of the world's cobalt in the world. So it just tells you how much that mine is very important, yes.
Now, what's also a dynamic of the past year and a half is that over this dispute over the contracts, the Congolese have effectively shut down production at TFM so that the cobalt can't leave. And so there's been a stockpile of $1.5 billion of cobalt and copper that's been piling up in the TFM mine. So that is another interesting dynamic. But let's go to the politics now. And this is very interesting. So the presidential election that Félix Tshiskedi is counting down towards is on December 20th. We are now the end of May, okay? That leaves him basically 7 months before the election. He's got to get this down. Now, the thing that I immediately thought about is that if he's going into these very difficult negotiations with Chinese state-owned companies who, by the way, know how to play the game in Congo really, really well.
Exactly.
Okay? These guys are not amateurs. They've been playing it. Why wouldn't they just run the clock down on Tshisekedi and make him sweat? Why not just say, you know what? We're going to take our time to negotiate this deal. And the closer we get to the election, the more concessions he's going to make. So this idea that they want to switch the sicko means from 60-40 or whatever it is to 70-30 in favor of the Congolese, in my view, never going to happen. Not even close. Now, that might be their opening offer, and they want to really get to a 40 or 50-50, but they start at 70. But there's no way, in my view, that they're going to do that. And all the Chinese have to do is run down the clock before the elections, because there's no guarantee that Tshisekedi wins. In fact, all over Twitter today was Moises Katumbi on the streets. And, Tshisekedi's gone, and he's making a huge play on social media today, to say, listen, there's chaos on the streets here, and it's Tshisekedi's fault. Give us the politics of this.
So exactly what you said, it's really right on the point. And this is echoes to one of the comments I've made earlier this week, questioning the timing of all this. Why to choose to start and launch a very tedious, complex negotiation with Chinese, who are notoriously known for dragging the clock on every major negotiation? Why you want to start such complex negotiation 7 months before elections in your country? And especially if you really want to use that new deal as an electoral argument during your campaign, you just chose the wrong timing of it. So when you take all of that, you just kind of wonder, is the timing was right? And does he have all the tools at his disposition to be able to negotiate a better deal? Because, as you said, the closer we get to that moment, the closer the political tension is going to rise in Kinshasa, in elsewhere in the country, and the closer pressure is going to mount among its own allies, the closer people in his circle. Because let's keep in mind that Chinese companies have been complaining about how they have to deal with certain Tshisekedi advisor who was asking money. I think I ran that story yesterday where they were complaining about how much they have to pay about Tshisekedi advisor. So the closer they get to election, the closer its allies are going to ask for money, to need for money for campaign and everything. All those elements are going to create a very strong internal political pressure that's going to put Congolese negotiators in a very difficult odd spot, because they're going to have to deal and to balance different current into the administration, different allies, different position, and Chinese are just going to sit and wait and see how long they can go with that. And just take an example, CIMOC, JCAMIN, they've been negotiating for almost a year and a half now. They announced an agreement last April, but yet we still have to wait for final details on the last agreement to be signed. It just tells you how much it's going to be much more complex to believe that they're going to go from what they ask and to get what they want. That's going to be a very tedious process. And if they attempt to say, okay, we're going to confrontation, my question will be, are you really willing to go on international court and international arbitration during election year with Chinese consortium? That's a very tricky situation.
We've seen both China and the United States playing into this drive from African countries to locate more mineral refining in Africa, and even to move towards battery manufacturing. On the Chinese side, there's been all of these rumors that there might be something being planned by CATL, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of electric vehicle batteries. So do you foresee any action on that front during this visit?
Personally, I do have my doubts on that. I remember in 2021, CATL sent a representative in Kinshasa. He met President Tshisekedi and different officials. The discussion has started. Even with JCAMIN officials, the discussion were on the ground. And then CATL really formally got 25% into the TFM project, became one of the shareholders in a certain way in the TFM project. So having CATL part of the deal, it kind of hints to the idea that CATL really wants to guarantee its supply from Cobalt from the DRC. But now that we know the DRC want to have supply chain built in the ground, CATL might now become that factors that they're going to play in a way that we can find the way to manage the compensation that JCAMIN is asking by having CATL to build the EV supply chain on the ground. And let's keep in mind the DRC has been signing a deal with Zambia and another one with the US and Zambia. So it tells you how much the DRC wants it to happen. But
Whoa. There was no deal signed with the US and Zambia. There was a piece of toilet paper that was signed that has, so There was nothing signed. I mean, there was a piece of paper. And in fact, what was very interesting was 2 Congolese ministers went to the State Department and pleaded with the State Department to get moving on this deal. But so far, nothing has happened. So it's not a deal. It's an MOU, which is really just
Exactly, yes. Let me correct. Yeah, a memorandum of understanding, so people know there was no formally deal signed. They're still in the process of making it happen. So in this context, do I see CATL now signing a big deal with the Congolese government during this trip? I doubt it, because of those 2 disputes that's ongoing right now. It really takes me to the comment that Tshisekedi made with his counterpart from the DRC, when he said he made his comment by saying that the DRC needs to guarantee the safety and the security of Chinese investment in the DRC. It just speaks to you about the certain level of concern and worriness that Beijing is starting to have toward the business environment, the mining business environment in the DRC. So when you take that into account, I really don't see how they're going to encourage another major big deal to be signed with the Congolese government right now. They're going to have to wait to find a solution.
Okay, but that being the case, let's not forget that CATL is a 25% shareholder of CMOC, of China Mali. So there is this corporate relationship, and we've seen the bigwigs from CATL in Kinshasa quite a bit over the past year. So it's not inconceivable that they do something. Now, there are some really important lessons that we should be looking at what's happening in Zimbabwe, and we just talked earlier on our China Global South show about how the difficulties that the Indonesians are having and how the Chinese have come to control not only the extraction of nickel in Indonesia, but now also the processing as well. So there's no guarantee that even if they start processing cobalt in the DRC, that it benefits the DRC any more than the extraction of cobalt does today. Okay, so it's been held out as this big panacea for a country to move up the value chain, but if CMOC and CATL own the entire process, well, all the profits kind of migrate there. Let's talk about security. This is a part of the dynamic that we don't hear very much in the China-Congo relationship, but one that is very, very interesting. So you've talked about the security of Chinese nationals. This is one that is a big problem for them. So if you recall, I think it was last year, was it the year before, where the Chinese basically gave an ultimatum to their own people who were in South Kivu and North Kivu and said, if you don't get out, you're on your own. And we're not coming to help you, and it is way too dangerous there. One of the things that we've been tracking for years is the kidnappings, the killings, the violence against Chinese who are there. Now, granted, it's not clear that the people are targeting the Chinese because they're Chinese. They're targeting the Chinese because they're in the middle of a war zone in many cases, and they're in a very unstable environment. But it is a concern for the Chinese nonetheless. The Ministry of Public Security sent a high-level delegation last year to Kinshasa to say, guys, you got to do something about this. You've got to help it. And the fact that Tshisekedi brought it up, I too was surprised. So it shows you where they are in that level of concern. Now, Geraud, you and I both believe there are no coincidences when you talk about Chinese politics. And the fact that on the same week that Tshisekedi is going to China, some beautiful CH-4 Rainbow drones landed in Kinshasa. These are the CH-4 drones. These are very powerful drones. 3 of a shipment of 9 arrived. They're going to be deployed into the eastern DRC to fight against the M23 rebels. And at the same time, these are the same drones, by the way, that were used in Ethiopia against Tigrayan forces. And in many ways, you got to think that the Tshisekedi government is seeing how drones really turn the war in many respects in Ethiopia, and maybe will look to say, okay, guys, let's use drones more effectively here to attack the M23 forces. So talk about the weapons issue here, because that is very, very interesting, and how the Chinese are selling very powerful weapons now.
So, as I was saying earlier, last year, Chinese ambassador in the United Nations kind of took the stance of the DRC, echoed on the DRC stand that was calling for the cancellation, basically the cancellation of the notification regime. Let me just clarify the notification regime. The DRC...
That was the UN arms embargo, right? In the Great Lakes region, right?
Exactly. So the DRC has been under that UN embargo for many years. So over the 5-6 years, they've kind of lightened the embargo, authorizing the DRC government to be able to buy those weapons without any notification. But there was a certain type of weapon that was like still under embargo, requiring a notification from the United Nations. So the DRC was feeling that there was still an embargo de facto. So they've been calling up on the UN that, we need that notification regime to be lifted to allow us to buy every weapon that we want freely. So China and Russia supported that stand, and finally the notification regime was lifted. So once it was lifted, like 2 months after the lifting, we heard that DRC and China signed the agreements to buy 9 drones from China. And even we had Chinese company arriving in Kinshasa proposing to sell jet fighters to the Congolese army. So it became a really big thing where we saw Chinese manufacturers arriving in Kinshasa trying to sell the weapons to the DRC. So in all that context, President Tshisekedi is trying to, to buy new weapons, new equipment for the DRC, for the army that's really fighting and struggling against the M23. So China has become that first choice to go to because, we can still trade arms for natural resources. You never know. So you still have people who can think that if we don't have the money to buy for it, we can find a way to compensate. So that is one of the angles that we should be looking at during this trip to see what company is going to visit, what weapon manufacturer is going to meet, what deal can be signed, and what promises are going to be made in that regard.
Does this dispute between the DRC and Rwanda, how does that play out geopolitically? Because there's a lot of pretty close cooperation between Rwanda and some Western powers, including particularly with the UK around migration. So I was wondering how that positions the DRC.
So yeah, that's a very tough, difficult situation because when it started in 2012, the DRC under President Kabila managed to get the international community to sanction Rwanda. So many aid were cut off Rwanda because of its support to M23. So now, 11 years later, somehow the international community is struggling to take the same position they took when they took it in 2012. And the DRC has been trying to advocate toward the United States. And here I'm going to shout out to the United States. It's the only country in the P5 who namely Rwanda and condemn Rwanda intervention into the DRC. Despite that condemnation, they never took real sanction the way they did against Rwanda in 2012. So that the geopolitical context of it. France was President Macron arrived in Kinshasa. He was really pressed hard by the press and by President Tshisekedi to officially name Rwanda. And he did it, reluctantly, he really did mention Rwanda. But the UK kind of managed to stay away from the Rwanda name is in the mouth to the very displeasing feeling of Kinshasa. So President Tshisekedi is arriving in Beijing with the feeling maybe to hope to get China's support, which is not guaranteed because all over this crisis, China has been saying, China is being China, never get involved in those kind of matters, calling both parties to dialogue, to find peaceful resolution, never take any stance against Rwanda. So if China can be counted and support a political ally, I really doubt it. And you won't get that much from China in terms of condemning Rwanda in that situation. And that's really quite sad when we know how much DRC is important to China's strategy in Africa.
So unfortunately, at the time of this recording, Tshisekedi and Xi have not met. They are rumored to meet sometime on Friday, most likely on Friday morning after we have shipped this show already. So we won't be able to give you any details of what they talked about. Fortunately for us, they don't really release many details after these things. They all talk about how, Tshisekedi is going to endorse the One China policy and applaud China for how wonderful it's doing with the Global Development Initiative. And it's all kind of, big, broad platitudes. We will probably know more about this in a few weeks and a month when the leaks start coming out and we see which way the negotiations are going. Now, it's interesting. I just want to close our discussion on the Congo with the fact that he's going to be in Beijing for about a day and a half. And then he's going to fly to Shanghai, and then he's going to fly to Shenzhen.
And Hong Kong.
And even Hong Kong, too. Okay, so what do you think he's going to do? Now, Shenzhen, I have my suspicions. They haven't actually released an itinerary or his schedule. Not unusual. This is typical for these types of state visits. Shenzhen, of course, is the hometown of Huawei. So, speaking of Huawei, and what we've been talking about today, but what do you think he's going to do in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong?
I do believe those meetings are going to turn around and Huawei strip to try to get Huawei to invest in the technology project they do have in DRC in terms of new technology, internet, infrastructure and all. From what I've heard, different rumors, they're going to have discussion with maybe oil and gas companies in Shanghai to try to convince some of them to invest in the DRC. And they're also going to meet a wide range of businessmen. So far, they haven't released a clear schedule of who they're going to meet, what they're going to talk about. But we have to read from the ministers who are part of the delegation. We have the environmental minister, we have the oil and gas minister, we have the finance minister. So we kind of anticipate a wide range of meetings and discussion with different businessmen and different companies. My concern will be, will they be able to make it in a very coherent and comprehensive way to make a very valuable trip out of this? Otherwise, it's just going to be a piling up of, MOU and agreements without really clear future of them.
So 2 other points that I want to bring up just before we move on, and it's related to the Congo only tangentially, is about the EV space. And there was some big news this week that the Volkswagen-backed EV battery maker Gotion, which is a Chinese company, came out with a brand new battery that can go 1,000 kilometers or about 620 miles on a single charge and does not use cobalt or nickel. Very, very interesting. And it's considered to be affordable. It's an iron-based EV battery. That all has to be taken into account that maybe cobalt may not be the resource as important today in the future as it is today. So something to think about, that these new technologies may leave cobalt behind. That may take a decade or so, but there is a desire in the West and even in China to rid themselves of the complexities of mining cobalt from the DRC.
But when you mention nickel, it's very bad news for the DRC, because at the beginning of this week, the mining minister of DRC, as you said, met with the China Moly CEO Sun Huiwen. And during the discussion, she mentioned that since China Moly has a nickel project in Latin America, they should also start investigating and exploring nickel in the DRC, because DRC is believed to have a some reserve of nickel in the Kasai region. Kasai, which is President Tshisekedi's hometown himself. So there is this also political mining situation playing out. So when you say that, it might be very bad news for the Congolese, who are kind of aware that people are shifting away from cobalt, they're going to nickel and lithium. So they're both trying to remain relevant in all those natural resources, both in lithium and nickel. So if they find solution without nickel, that might be really something to worry about in Kinshasa.
And then in South Africa this week, word came out that BYD, the world's largest EV manufacturer, even larger than Tesla, is going to be launching their new Atto 3 crossover SUV. This is a crossover SUV it's electrified. It's already in a number of markets. But the way that they're positioning the marketing, Cobus, in South Africa is unique to South Africa. And they're basically adding a feature to it that says this is not only a car, it not only has great electronics, it not only has great range, but it will help you in event of load shedding. You can literally plug the car into your home appliances and power your home appliances when the power goes down because Eskom is messing up again.
Yes.
Something tells me that's actually going to be a very effective marketing tactic.
I think so. I mean, I was immediately thinking when I was like, oh, great, you can charge your laptop off your car. Fantastic, let's go. Like I think South Africans, it's going to make sense to them immediately.
And interesting also, a couple of weeks ago, Huawei, which is selling these power walls, like the Tesla power walls, they're these huge batteries that either connect to the grid or to solar panels, did a big price cut on these things in order to kind of really, I think, promote adoption in the market. It seems like the dysfunctions in Eskom are really promoting and giving an opportunity to Chinese companies like Huawei and BYD to fill in this space of alternative power supplies.
Yeah, there are. Like what you're seeing in a larger context is this increasing erosion of state kind of goods, state service provision, and this seeping in of the private sector everywhere. So it's not only the Chinese, like every single promotion, every single kind of, reader competition put out by publications and so on, all of the prizes that they're offering are all like generators and electricity backup and, battery backup and so on. But at the same time, one of the weird specifics of how weird South Africa is that it's a state which is both massively corrupt and incredibly inefficient. and yet at the same time super interventionist. So you're seeing now that increasingly towns in South Africa are trying to kind of use private sector partnerships to try and get themselves to lessen the impact of these electricity cuts, and now they're being sued by the government for doing it. So it's a situation where the government keeps trying to protect Eskom even as Eskom itself is falling apart.
So, Cobus, just very quickly, back to diplomacy just before we leave here. It's been a very busy week. In addition to the Congolese who are in Beijing, also Ethiopian Foreign Affairs Minister Demeke Mekonnen was in Beijing and is there on a 4-day trip and met with Qingang on Thursday, likely talking about, my guess is Sudan and debt issues, but tell me a little bit about what you're thinking that's on their agenda.
I was also thinking Sudan and debt, probably. Ethiopia is creeping towards debt problems, and it's one of the largest holders of Chinese debt in Africa. And famously, the Chinese, in addition to the railway connecting it to Djibouti, for example, they also built these massive special economic zones, which really fueled a lot of manufacturing in Ethiopia before the civil war then shut a lot of that down. So, I can well imagine that now that the civil war's kind of simmered down, that, that they might want renewed kind of engagement to try and kind of kickstart some of those initiatives again. It's also another person who's, just as a side note, another person who's also visiting Beijing this week is the head of the Senegalese Air Force. So he's meeting with people in the People's Liberation Army, so like counterparts in the People's Liberation Army. So we'll see what comes out.
That's so interesting. So I'm looking at the Xinhua readout of the meeting between the Chinese and the Ethiopian foreign ministers. The only reference to Sudan that's there is that Qin reportedly thanked the Ethiopian government for supporting and assisting the Chinese during their evacuation of their nationals from Sudan. So no mention of any of the possible diplomacy. My suspicion is that the Chinese won't get involved in the diplomacy in Sudan when it's a kind of hot mess the way it is now. But if things start to calm down, then you could see Ethiopia being a partner to bring the Chinese, and Xue Bing is the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, who, my view of this guy is that he's an empty suit. I mean, he is just useless in many respects, but other people say he's, supposedly competent. I don't know, but I haven't seen anything effective coming out of him in the past year since he's been, appointed to that.
There's another little data point that we picked up today, is that apparently Egypt is in negotiation with Chinese companies to buy new fighter jets. Egypt obviously has a long-term disputes with Ethiopia around water, but Egypt's also very deeply pulled into the current situation in Sudan. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, and Egypt also this week floated its first panda bond, which is a UN-denominated bond. So that's another little interesting talking point. So lots going on. These are the kind of weird, tiny little factoid details that, this bunch of nerds that we have here who follow China news as closely as we do love to kind of obsess over, and we do it every single day. I mean, and Geraud's doing it not only in English, but also in French. He's the editor of Projet Afrique Chine. That's our French language service. If you want to sign up for his newsletter, just go to his website. There's a little field right up at the top. When do you send out your newsletters every week?
Every Tuesday and every Friday, you have Bulletin du Jour on Tuesday, and Friday we have like a condensed of what we talk during the week and one analysis piece.
Okay, and you've got a nice little archive of podcasts as well on your site. Tell us a little bit more about some of the other things that you're doing.
Exactly. I have a lot of a good bunch of archives when it comes to podcasts, and for that I'd like to even launch a call here for those who know any researcher in Africa who are following China, who's really interesting in China, who is really interested by China and who does it in French. I would like to have them on the podcast to talk about different issues that we have, because so far we've noticed there are not a lot of Francophone speakers following China in Africa, and if they are, they're not really visible. We'd like to give them the space.
I mean, let's be a little bit more blunt here, okay? There are some people, and he's being polite, everybody. But what is fascinating about this is that everybody Geraud reaches out to says, nope, not going there. It's incredible. It is fascinating. And, the worst are the French. They are some of the worst. And it's amazing to see. It took me by surprise how difficult it is to get people to talk. I am blown away by how many no's you're getting. I mean, it's just really incredible. It's fascinating. I mean, it's hard for us It's because you're basically getting treated worldwide the way that we get treated when we try and get Chinese guests to come on the show, which is just ghosted all the time. But I'm surprised that people wouldn't want to talk more about it. But I just can't figure out why they're just so afraid of having a public discussion on these things.
I don't know. So anyway, those who know, I'd like to have them on the show. We really want to give voice to African voice, really following in China and French. And just reach out to me, and we're going to leave contact in the show notes. You can reach out to me on Twitter, and we're going to have a discussion. So those are the things that we do in Chain Projet Afrique Chine. We follow all the different tiny stories, and we're going to have some big project coming up in the coming month. We're going to talk about that later. But this is what we do. So that's a big one. That's going to keep that for later. Yes.
Yeah, no, let's keep that under wraps. We've got 2 really fun projects that we're going to unveil in the next couple months. I mean, just so cool. And I can't wait to tell everybody about it. So and Geraud's working on one, I'm working on another, and it's going to be so neat, so cool. So wait for that. But you can feel me. I just want to tell everybody, but we can't right now. So let's keep it there. So, okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your time. If you want to follow Geraud, where can they find you on the interweb?
They can find me on Twitter on Afrique Chine for the China Projet Afrique Chine, on my personal Twitter feed on Christian Geraud, Christian, one word, Geraud, G-E-R-A-U-D. So you can find me there. You're going to find a lot of news that I share about DRC, China, international politics, and all.
And we'll put links to all of our Twitter handles in the show notes. And if you want to reach out to me, you can get me at Eric, E-R-I-C, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And if you want to reach Cobus, C-O-B-U-S, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to listen. We will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, I'm Eric Olander for Cobus and Geraud. Thanks so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.